The 2014 version of Shield was widely considered to be one of the best spells in Dungeons & Dragons. On its own, it was able to massively nullify one of the typical assumptions of spellcasting characters, that they're squishy, and to make it so that they could easily match or even exceed the defense of their martial counterparts. And yeah, I know that it isn't always the case, we get it. That's why I said it's the typical assumption. Anyway, the point is that Shield was an incredibly strong spell. Whether or not you think it was overpowered or broken is largely inconsequential. You don't need to think that something is busted to also acknowledge that it's quite good. Hey, I'm less than 100 subscribers away from hitting 10,000. I would love to make this video the one that puts me over the top, so if you want to help me out on this goal, a sub to the channel would be amazing. I've got some very fun announcements lined up as well, so be sure to stay tuned. Thanks. Shield had a number of things going for it. Firstly, it was relatively cheap, but it also lasted a while. Granted, in the early levels, even your first level spell slots can be quite precious, but I mean, a dead character does no damage, so even then, at least it is protecting you and keeping you up, even if all you were doing otherwise was just firing off cantrips. But also yeah, it just lasted for a long time. The fact that it lasted until the start of your next turn is not something to be lightly dismissed. This means that it works against multi-attacks and attacks from different creatures. As many things that decided that they were hitting you, that same casting of Shield had the chance to protect you from it. As a result, you were able to derive a significant amount of value from just a single first level spell slot. And it's a reaction spell, and given that there aren't all that many useful ones to choose from, and it doesn't require you to spend your turn pre-casting it, it also slots quite neatly into just about any round without much, if any, sacrifice. And the thing is that it didn't even stop there. Shield scales incredibly well into the late game, despite not requiring any upcasting. While there's obviously some, there aren't a ton of low-level spells that you're gonna feel all that great about casting in the late game, say levels 10 and above. And the ones that you are gonna use, you're likely gonna be upcasting. Even everyone's favorite, Fireball, isn't necessarily all that great when you're fighting high-level creatures. 8d6 damage with half on a save just isn't quite cutting it in tiers 3 and 4. And if you do use Fireball, you're probably going to be upcasting it. The point I'm making is that, generally speaking at least, as you level up and get access to more and better spells, you're probably going to be wanting to use those more often. Shield though, along with a few others like Hypnotic Pattern and who could forget Crown of Madness, are just so good even at their lowest level that there's genuinely no point in upcasting them. Shield doesn't even have an upcasting option. No matter what spell slot level you're using it at, you're just getting the same effect. And guess what? We're still not done, because unlike other defensive spells that a caster may use like Mage Armor that specifies that the target must not be wearing any armor, yeah, Shield has no such restrictions, so it can actually benefit from both wearing armor or having Mage Armor cast on yourself. So with all that out of the way, let's talk a little bit about the design intent of the Shield spell, why it exists, and why the D&D team felt like doing nothing about it was the right call for 2024. The Shield spell actually dates way back to 1st edition D&D, while where it did work differently, it still largely had the same fundamental effect. That being to protect a spellcaster from incoming damage. And honestly, it's easy enough to understand why this spell exists. Wizards and the like don't often tend to be clad in heavy plate mail on the battlefield. The usual imagery of a spellcaster is someone further back, hurling spells toward the action, while maybe wearing robes or leathers at best. This obviously has the downside of leaving them with rather weaker defenses. To compensate for that, the Shield spell was created to allow casters to use one of their own core resources, their spell slots, to instead opt for defending themselves whenever necessary. The effect is temporary, it's resource consuming, and it also feels very on brand and thematic for exactly what you would expect a wizard standing in the middle of a battle to be able to do, to throw up a protective ward to keep themselves safe. What was interesting about the implementation of Shield in 1st edition is that it offered a sliding scale of armor class depending on what types of attacks were being directed towards you. Shield in 1st edition would provide the effectiveness of Armor Class 2 against what essentially amounts to thrown weapons like axes and javelins, Armor Class 3 against arrows or bolts, and Armor Class 4 against all other forms of attack. It's also probably worth mentioning that Armor Class worked very differently in 1st and 2nd editions. In case you don't know, basically the lower your AC, the better. The scale went from 10 to -10, with -10 being more or less impossible to hit. For a bit of context, an AC of 2 is what wearing plate mail and carrying a shield would provide, and an AC of 4 would be what a chainmail and a shield would provide. For some context, in 5e, that would be equivalent to about an AC of 20 or 18 respectively. Also, interestingly enough, even then it fully negated Magic Missile, which is kind of a neat piece of trivia. Probably the most noteworthy element of Shield in 1st edition though, was the fact that it was directional. It only protected you from the front. The reason this is so wild, I mean to me at least, is just because it's yet another example of a mechanic which was so core to the game and has now gone on to become an obscure variant rule. Directional facing mattered in the early days of D&D, but it just doesn't anymore. I'm sure there's a solid dozen or so people that actively use facing in 5e, but the reality is that the vast majority of players just don't. The assumption is just that your characters are tracking everything around them. In case you weren't aware though, the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide does actually provide an optional rule for facing, but it's pretty bad and will needlessly slow down and complicate your games, but hey, it exists. I am curious if it'll stick around for the 2024 edition though. Out of sheer curiosity though, I ran a poll last week asking if people use facing in their games. And at the time of writing, with over 1,100 votes cast, 50% of respondents said that they outright don't use it, and 43% said that they didn't even know what it was. I feel like there's a video in here somewhere. Anyway, jumping ahead from 1st edition up to 2014, with 5th edition, Shield was still around, and like I mentioned at the beginning, is pretty much inarguably one of the most powerful spells in the game. In fact, I ran another poll last week with over 1,400 votes cast, and at the time of writing, 54% of respondents said that they felt that it was overpowered. And for the 39% of people who said that it wasn't overpowered, they're not saying it's not very strong, just that they don't think it was OP. That's a significant result, and many of the comments highlight the common troubles that the community has had with Shield for the last decade. Most of which were what we already discussed at the beginning of the video, but one other pretty big one that was brought up was the impact of multiclassing. While some mentioned the potential for a martial character to dip into wizard or sorcerer to be able to get access to Shield, given how few spell slots would be available, that doesn't feel like that big of a deal. The bigger deal, which many also addressed, was multiclassing the other way around. Either another full caster dipping into wizard just to get access to Shield, or a wizard dipping into a martial class to get armor and shield proficiencies to stack with it. Combos like this can rapidly ramp the effectiveness of the spell and allow for a character's AC to easily score into the 20s. So with all this context, the stage was very much set for the 2024 Player's Handbook to massively tone down the power of the spell. Whether you wanted it to happen or not, this is certainly something that many people were expecting to happen, given the sheer volume of discussion that the spell has had over the last 10 years, and the general feeling of overpoweredness that came along with it. There were countless suggestions for how to tone down the spell, but to maintain its general function and theme. Reducing the AC bonus from +5 to a +2, for example, or having it start at a +2 and then gain an extra +1 for every slot level, or even every second slot level above first. This kind of puts it in line with the way that magic weapons scales too. Other suggestions included making it only work for the triggering attack and keeping the +5, or borrowing a page from mage armor and require it so that the caster isn't wearing any armor in order to benefit from the spell. I think the last option was my personal favorite, but I know I'm not alone in expecting that there was going to be at least some change made. Well, would it surprise you to learn that the change that they made was actually none of the things that I've suggested here? The team instead went down a very different route when it came to designing the spell for 2024. They changed it from being an invisible barrier of magical force that appears and protects you to being an imperceptible barrier of magical force that protects you. And I'll be honest, this feels like a solid change in my book. After all, it was so weird to describe something as being both invisible and appearing. Oh, wait, no, it still actually works exactly the same. They didn't change the functionality of Shield at all for 2024. This was jarring to say the least. To be abundantly clear, in case my very witty joke didn't come across, Shield in 2024 is functionally identical to 2014. The same triggers, the same cost, the same AC boost, the same everything, except a tiny bit of flavor text, so there's that. So this then begs the obvious question, why? Why on earth, after years of what I can only imagine amounts to infinite complaints about the spell and a seemingly equivalent number of discussions about it, was the spell just not changed at all? Did they just forget? The thing is though, that the answer to this question raises a whole host of other ones. To answer the question of why did they do nothing about it, I think it's pretty obvious. They didn't want players to feel like their toys were being taken away. Shield is a powerful spell. It's incredibly easy to understand what it does and why it's so good. But most importantly, it's damn fun to use and play. That is, if you're the one casting it at least. Slamming down those 3 words, I cast shield, after a monster rolls well against you is such a godlike feeling of power, only rivaled by when something is falling and you just manage to hit it with your foot so it doesn't hit the floor at full impact. Need I say more? Jokes aside though, I really do think that that's it. The spell is very fun to use, it does exactly what you would expect it to do, and the team clearly didn't want to remove elements that players experience as being fun, even if the design of the spell may have been problematic. Now, just because they did nothing doesn't mean that they did nothing. Instead of making any change to shield, they instead opted to buff other defensive options in the game to bring them on par with it. Let's talk about that. In one of the interviews that Jeremy Crawford did in the lead up to the release of the 2024 Player's Handbook, he mentioned that rather than do anything to shield itself, the team instead opted to increase the power of other defensive options, most notably the defensive duelist feature, but others were changed as well, including the evasive footwork maneuver and the protection fighting style. Now, to be clear, doing this is a perfectly valid direction in game design. It's something that I often refer to as balancing up, the notion of improving weaker options rather than weakening the very good options. The thing is though, while I am generally speaking a big fan of this type of design, it isn't always the right call. Game design is an incredibly challenging process, to say the least. There are so many moving parts which all interconnect in different ways. As a result, changing anything can easily have knock-on effects somewhere unexpected. This is typically why in most games you'll see reduction in power to outliers rather than buffs to multiple things to catch up to the powerful thing. During development, a general power level is decided upon, and it's simply just a lot easier and more controllable to address one element than it is to address multiple other things, and this becomes especially true when you're dealing with core mechanics of a game. Armor class is not something unique to wizards and sorcerers, it's not even unique to all classes. Not only does every player character have an associated armor class, but so does every NPC and monster too. AC is a foundational element of D&D's defensive systems, and any changes to that can have massive impacts across the board. Something that multiple commenters brought up in the poll, and probably like a trillion other people have over the last 10 years as well, is the notion of bounded accuracy. Generally speaking, D&D is living its best life with more controlled values on rolls and scores. But whenever significant and unexpected modifiers get thrown into the mix, things tend to break down pretty quickly. This is a big part of why high-level games can be extremely challenging to run, because once players can consistently start hitting into the 30s with their rolls, nothing really makes sense anymore. And likewise, once an armor class exceeds the typical limits that the game was designed around, well, nothing really makes sense anymore. And sure, you can argue that you could just arbitrarily inflate the to-hit modifiers on creatures to hit the new higher ACs, but at that point, it's no different than just not doing that and keeping armor classes constrained to their expected limits. This is what I'm trying to get at when I say that balancing up isn't always the right thing to do. While those other options like defensive duelists probably should have always been made better, a big part of why they felt bad wasn't really the existence of shield. Based on my poll and just existing in the D&D community for many years now has shown me that the more perceptible issue has always been with shield than it has been with the other options. So while making defensive duelist or evasive footwork last for the entire round absolutely makes them more appealing, it doesn't actually address any of the issues that people have always had with shield. In fact, it just doubles down on the issues. The problem hasn't been a comparative one. The problem has always been how cheap it is, how long it lasts, how effective it is, how it stacks with armor, and how much better it is with multiclassing, and how it goes so well into the late game. Making other options better changes none of that. Instead, it only exacerbates another issue that has been plaguing 5e for the last 10 years, challenge rating. Challenge rating is supposed to serve as a singular condensed metric for determining how powerful a creature might be, and it factors in tons of different elements like hit points, damage, attacks, resistances, and armor class, among others. But at basically no point in 5e's history has CR been a reliable tool though. There is incredible variance within challenge ratings, with many creatures punching way above or way below it. I've made multiple videos showing off some of these examples, but now consider that the design team has been stating that they've gone out of their way to ensure that creatures are in fact hitting at their CR. A change like we're seeing with shield and the other defensive options almost makes that statement seem impossible. Any creature that felt appropriately placed and that didn't get any update will now almost necessarily fall short because of how much more accessible and consistent armor has become. The average to hit modifiers will need to increase to keep up with the assumption of increased player durability. And no, not everyone is going to take shield or defensive duelist or evasive footwork, but because those options do exist, and because of how easily accessible they are, basically all monster balance needs to be completely revisited to ensure that things are still hitting their intended power level. This is why balancing up is hard and should generally not be done on global systems unless your intention is to significantly increase the average power level of your game across the board. It tends to work better on more isolated systems. Take the Hunter's subclass for Ranger, for example. In regard to the Hunter's Prey and Defensive Tactics feature, they didn't make the good options worse. They balanced up, they got rid of the bad options, improved the ones that were being picked, and made it so that you could change your choice on a short or long rest. That, in my opinion, is a perfect example of balancing up done well. The changes, or lack of changes, to shield though, I'm much more conflicted about. To some of my wonderful commenters who insist that I hate buffs and just love nerfs oh so much, I hate to disappoint you here, but I think it's really just too early to tell whether the direction the design team has chosen is a good one or not. In order to really see how everything shakes out, we're gonna need to see what the new monster manual has in store for us. Before we can truly evaluate this new reality, it's extremely important that we're able to compare it to the threats that determine our relative strength. Way beyond just armor and defense though, it's very clear that the D&D team has increased the average power level of the game already. So there's always the possibility that this just falls in line with that. I'm still a bit dubious about how it all is going to play out, but we'll only fully understand come February when we do see the new monster manual. Maybe they truly have completely reevaluated every creature in the game. I won't say I'm holding my breath, but anything's possible. What I will say though, and this will probably upset those commenters even more, is that I think the general improvements to what used to feel like trapped defensive options is a very good thing. It's just the inner game designer that feels like opting to do nothing about shield might not have been the best choice. Both things could have happened, but I guess time will tell. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Consider subscribing to help me reach that goal of 10,000. Check out some of my other D&D videos, but otherwise, take care.